The courtyard smelled like wet stone, and something sharper. Fear, maybe. Or the particular tension that comes when too many wolves gather in one place with their teeth showing. I stood near the back wall where the ivy grew thickest, my blonde hair pulled into a braid that kept slipping loose no matter how many times I fixed it. Nobody looked at me. That was normal. Omegas weren't meant to be looked at during council sessions, unless someone needed to make a point about hierarchy or tradition. The assembly hall loomed ahead, its arched doorways framed by torches that guttered in the evening wind. Inside, voices rose and fell in argument. I could hear Alpha Garrett's baritone cutting through the noise, and someone else, maybe Helena from the eastern border, shouting something about territory rights. My fingers found the edge of my sleeve and worried at a loose thread. I shouldn't have been there at all. Kitchen staff didn't attend council meetings. But Miriam had sent me with a message for the head steward, and I'd arrived just as the session dissolved into chaos. Move. The word came from behind me, low and irritated. I stepped aside without looking up, pressing myself against the damp stone. Heavy boots passed, then stopped. You're the one who works mornings in the East Wing. It wasn't a question. I risked a glance and immediately regretted it. Dante Ashford stood 3 feet away, his dark coat still dusty from travel. The Alpha King's younger brother had a reputation that preceded him like smoke before fire, charming when it suited him, vicious when it didn't. His eyes were the same slate gray as the King's, but where the King's gaze felt like judgment, Dante's felt like appraisal. Yes, Alpha. I kept my voice flat, neutral. What's your name? Celine. He tilted his head, studying me with the kind of attention that made my skin prickle. Selene. You're afraid of me. I'm not. The lie came out too quickly, his mouth curved. Even better. Listen carefully, Celine, who works mornings. There's going to be a vote tonight about the peripheral laws, those old regulations that dictate how Omegas are assigned housing, work, movement. The council wants to keep them. I want them burned. He stepped closer, and I caught the scent of pine and leather. I need someone who can tell me what the household staff really thinks. Not what they say to avoid trouble, what they actually believe. My throat went dry. Why would you need that? Because no one tells the truth in council chambers. They perform. His eyes held mine. Will you help me? Before I could answer, before I could even process what he was asking, the heavy doors of the assembly hall slammed open. The crowd that had been arguing inside began spilling into the courtyard, and with them came a wave of displaced air that smelled like old parchment and anger. And then he was there. Theron Ashford didn't walk like other people. He moved like water finding its level, inevitable and unhurried. The Alpha King wore his authority the way some men wore cologne, so thoroughly integrated it became indistinguishable from his presence. His dark hair was tied back, revealing the sharp angles of his face, and his gray eyes swept across the courtyard with methodical precision. They landed on me, on Dante standing too close to me. The temperature dropped. I watched something flicker across Theron's face. Something too fast to name but slow enough to feel. His jaw tightened. His hands, which had been loose at his sides, curled into fists, and then deliberately relaxed. When he spoke, his voice carried despite its quietness. Dante. A word. It wasn't a request. Dante's smile widened, sharp and knowing. He leaned down, his breath warm against my ear. Think about what I said. Then he straightened and sauntered toward his brother with the lazy confidence of someone who enjoyed provoking reactions. I should have left. Should have delivered Miriam's message and disappeared back into the kitchen where I belonged. Instead, I stayed frozen against the wall, watching the two of them face each other in the center of the courtyard. The crowd gave them space instinctively. Even the arguing had stopped. You have something to say to me, brother? Dante's voice carried amusement. Theron's expression remained neutral, but there was something coiled in his posture. Stay away from her. Her? Dante glanced back at me, eyebrows raised in mock surprise. The kitchen girl? Why? I was only having a conversation. I'm not interested in your games. Games. Dante laughed, but there was no humor in it. You're the one who looks ready to tear my throat out over a 30-second conversation. That seems disproportionate, don't you think? The silence that followed felt thick enough to choke on. I could see other wolves watching now, their attention shifting between the brothers with the hungry interest of people witnessing something they'd later gossip about. My chest tightened. This was my fault somehow. I'd become visible at exactly the wrong moment. Theron took one step closer to his brother.
I said, get
Just
out.
one. But the movement carried weight.
I will
This
not
isn't a
repeat
discussion.
myself.
For a moment, I thought Dante might push back. His shoulders tensed, and that sharp smile turned brittle. Then he raised his hands in surrender, the gesture theatrical. Of course. Whatever you say, Your Majesty. He turned on his heel and walked away, but not before throwing me one last look, curious and calculating. The crowd began to disperse, conversation resuming in hushed tones. I finally unstuck myself from the wall and started toward the servants' entrance, keeping my head down. I made it maybe 10 steps before a hand caught my wrist, not roughly, but firmly enough that I stopped. Wait. Theron's voice was closer than I'd expected. I turned slowly and found him standing there with an expression I couldn't read. Up close, he was taller than I'd realized, broader. There were lines at the corners of his eyes that suggested he smiled sometimes, though I'd never seen it. I'm sorry, I said automatically. I didn't mean to cause trouble. You didn't. He released my wrist but didn't step back.
Why didn't you leave?
What did Dante want? The question felt like a test. I thought about lying, but something about the directness of his gaze made it seem pointless. He asked if I would tell him what the household staff thinks about the peripheral laws, the real opinions, not the public ones. Theron's eyes narrowed fractionally. And what did you say? Nothing. You interrupted before I could answer. Good.
Now I know.
He exhaled,
It's time.
and some of the tension left his shoulders. Those laws are being reviewed by the council.
Our opportunity
There are
lies in the narrow path
competing
we're
interests. Dante thinks he's helping by gathering intelligence, but he's only making the situation more complicated. I should have nodded and left, should have remembered my place. Instead, I heard myself ask,
on. Your name.
"What do you think? About the laws?"
Your name.
He looked at me for a long moment, and I couldn't tell if I'd overstepped or if he was simply surprised by the question.
I should have.
Finally, he said, "I think they're relics from a different time, but changing them requires more than good intentions. It requires strategy,
It's not so simple.
and Dante doesn't have strategy.
Decision now rests
Dante has passion. That's not the same thing." Theron's gaze drifted past me, toward the assembly hall. The council meets again tomorrow night. There will be a formal vote. If you hear anything at all, that seems important, I want you to find me. My stomach twisted. I'm not a spy. I'm not asking you to be. He looked back at me, and something in his expression softened just slightly. I'm asking you to care about your own future. Because if the peripheral laws stand as they are, you'll be reassigned to the Western Barracks by month's end.
They took heavy losses.
That's what the council wants.
We need to leave
Consolidation,
now. It's not safe.
control. The Western Barracks. I'd heard stories. Overcrowded dormitories where 20 Omegas shared rooms built for 8. Mandatory rotations that meant you never stayed in one place long enough to form connections. Rules about when you could speak, where you could go, who you could talk to. Why do you care what happens to me? The question came out sharper than I'd intended.
My decision to make.
Theron held my gaze. I don't know yet.
I regret
The honesty
that.
of it surprised me more than any diplomatic answer would have.
There was no other way.
Before I could respond, he turned and walked back toward the assembly hall, his dark coat billowing behind him. I stood there in the emptying courtyard, my heart beating too fast, trying to understand what had just happened. Around me, the torches flickered in their brackets, the ivy rustled against the stone wall. And somewhere in the administrative wing, I knew there was a document, old, authoritative, unquestioned, that spelled out exactly how much freedom people like me were allowed to have. I'd never actually read the peripheral laws. Most Omegas hadn't. We just lived inside their boundaries, accepting them as fixed as the seasons. But Theron's words echoed in my mind, relics from a different time. I made my way back to the kitchens, delivered Miriam's message about flour supplies, and spent the next hour scrubbing pots while the other staff talked about the council meeting. Nobody mentioned me. Nobody had seen me standing against that wall, caught between two alphas like a piece on a game board I didn't understand. When I finally lay down in my narrow bed in the servants' quarters that night, sleep wouldn't come. I kept thinking about the look on Theron's face when he'd seen Dante standing close to me, the way his hands had curled into fists,
And she's using it.
the temperature drop that had nothing to do with weather. And I thought about his brother's sharp smile, the calculating interest in his eyes, whatever was happening. I was already tangled in it. The only question was whether I'd be crushed in the process, or whether, impossibly, I might find a way to matter. Morning came too early. I woke to the sound of the breakfast bell, and dressed in the half-dark, my fingers clumsy with the laces of my work dress. The fabric was worn thin at the elbows, but it was clean. That mattered. In a place where you were already invisible, slovenliness became a mark of character rather than circumstance. The kitchen was warm and loud when I arrived, filled with the clatter of pans and the sharp voices of cooks organizing the day's work. Miriam stood near the ovens, her graying hair pulled back in a severe bun, directing two younger girls toward the vegetable stores. She saw me and jerked her chin toward the serving trays. Northern wing breakfast. Don't dawdle. I loaded the cart with bread, preserved fruit, and the weak tea that passed for morning beverage. The northern wing housed visiting dignitaries and council members who'd traveled from border territories. It meant careful presentation and absolute silence during service. I'd done the route dozens of times. What I hadn't expected was Dante Ashford lounging in the corridor outside his guest quarters, looking like he'd been waiting. Celine. He straightened when he saw me, that same appraising look from yesterday flickering across his face. Perfect timing. Walk with me. I have deliveries. They can wait. He fell into step beside me without asking permission, his presence making the hallway feel smaller. Did you think about what I said, about the peripheral laws? I kept my eyes forward, focusing on pushing the cart in a straight line. I don't have opinions worth hearing. Everyone has opinions. Most people are just afraid to voice them. He paused, then added quietly, I saw how my brother looked at you yesterday. That must have been uncomfortable. My hands tightened on the cart handle. The Alpha King was addressing you, not me. Was he? Dante's voice carried something amused and knowing. Theron doesn't lose his composure over nothing. I've been trying to rattle him for years with minimal success. Then you appear, and suddenly he's ready to start a fight in front of the entire council. He leaned closer, lowering his voice. What does that tell you? That I should stay out of your family's business. He laughed, a short, genuine sound. Smart. But unfortunately, you're already in it. The question is whether you're going to be a pawn or a player. Before I could answer, footsteps echoed from the main stairwell. We both turned as Theron emerged onto the landing, followed by Marcus Chen, the council's record keeper. They were deep in conversation, Marcus gesturing with a rolled document while Theron listened with that characteristic intensity he brought to everything. Then Theron's gaze lifted and found us. Found me, standing there with Dante beside the breakfast cart. The change in his expression was minute. A tightening around his eyes, a subtle shift in his posture, but I felt it like a physical thing. Marcus continued talking, apparently oblivious, but Theron had stopped listening. His attention was fixed on his brother with the kind of focus that made the air feel charged. Dante naturally smiled. Brother. We were just discussing the fascinating nuances of breakfast delivery. His tone was light, deliberately provocative. Did you know there's an entire protocol for how fruit should be arranged on serving trays? I'm learning so much. Theron descended the remaining steps with measured calm. When he spoke, his voice was level. Marcus, please take those documents to my study. I'll review them shortly. Marcus blinked, clearly surprised by the dismissal, but he nodded and retreated down the corridor. The moment he was gone, Theron turned to Dante. What are you doing? Having a conversation. Is that forbidden now? In the middle of a servant's work schedule? Yes, actually. Theron's jaw was tight. She has responsibilities, so protective. Dante's smile widened. You know, if I didn't know better, I'd think, don't. The single word cut through whatever Dante had been about to say. Theron took a step forward, closing the distance between them. Don't finish that sentence. I should have left. Should have taken the cart and disappeared before this escalated into something worse. But my feet wouldn't move. There was something almost hypnotic about watching them face each other. Two men who shared the same blood, and apparently nothing else. Dante raised his hands in mock surrender again. Fine. I'll leave your servant alone. He emphasized the word just enough to make it sting. Then he brushed past his brother and walked away, his footsteps echoing down the empty corridor. The silence that followed felt oppressive. I stared at the breakfast cart, at the carefully arranged fruit, and the steam still rising from the tea. My heart was beating too fast. I apologize for my brother. Theron's voice was quieter now, but there was still an edge to it. You don't need to apologize to me. Yes, I do. He moved closer, and I forced myself to look up. His eyes were storm gray in the morning light, filtering through the high windows. Dante enjoys chaos. He always has. But that doesn't mean you should be caught in it. Why does it matter? The question slipped out before I could stop it. I'm nobody. Just kitchen staff. Yesterday you said you didn't know why you cared, and now you're... I gestured vaguely at the space Dante had occupied. This. Theron was quiet for a moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was careful. The council vote is tonight. There are 9 members present, and the decision needs a 2/3 majority to pass. Right now, the split is 5-4 in favor of maintaining the peripheral laws as written. He paused. If they win, your life becomes significantly harder, along with every other Omega in this territory. So this is about politics, yes. He held my gaze. And no. The contradiction hung between us. I didn't know what to do with it. Didn't know how to reconcile the Alpha King standing in front of me, rumpled from early meetings, shadows under his eyes suggesting he hadn't slept well, with the distant, authoritative figure I'd watched from afar for months. What happens if the vote fails? I asked. Then the laws go back for revision. It buys time, allows for negotiation. His expression darkened slightly, but there are council members who see any change as weakness. They believe hierarchy exists for a reason, and that questioning it invites chaos. And you don't believe that? I believe hierarchy without flexibility becomes tyranny. He looked past me, toward the windows overlooking the eastern courtyard. My father built this pack on strict codes, clear boundaries. It worked when we were smaller, when threats came from outside and unity meant survival, but we've grown. Territories have expanded, and the laws he created don't account for that complexity. I'd never heard anyone speak about the former Alpha King with anything less than reverence. The criticism, gentle as it was, felt almost transgressive. You're afraid of what your father would think, I said quietly. Theron's eyes snapped back to mine, sharp with surprise. Then something in his expression softened. Yes, I suppose I am. The admission felt significant, though I couldn't articulate exactly why. We stood there in the quiet corridor, the breakfast cart between us growing cold, and I realized with uncomfortable clarity that this man, this Alpha King with his careful control and his impossible responsibilities, was just as trapped as I was. Different cage, same fundamental helplessness. I should finish my deliveries, I said finally. He nodded but didn't move away. Tonight, after the vote concludes, I'll need to address the household staff. All of them, regardless of rank. If you could spread the word in the kitchens. Of course. And Selena, he waited until I met his eyes again. Stay away from Dante, please. He means well in his own chaotic fashion, but he doesn't think about collateral damage. I wanted to ask what kind of damage he meant. Wanted to understand why his brother's attention, brief and seemingly harmless, provoked such a visceral response. But the question felt too intimate, too much like peeling back layers I had no right to examine. So instead, I just nodded and pushed the cart past him, feeling his gaze follow me down the corridor. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of routine tasks. I delivered breakfast, collected empty trays, helped prep vegetables for the evening meal. The kitchen staff buzzed with speculation about the council vote, everyone offering opinions they'd overheard from visiting wolves or interpreted from cryptic comments. Nobody asked what I thought. I was grateful for that. But my mind kept circling back to that moment in the corridor. The way Theron had looked at Dante, the way he'd looked at me. By afternoon, word had spread about the mandatory assembly. The head cook complained loudly about the disruption to dinner preparations, but even she couldn't deny the Alpha King's direct order. We would gather in the Great Hall at sunset, immediately following the council's decision. I spent the intervening hours trying not to think about what any of it meant. Trying not to wonder why Theron's concern felt different from simple political calculation. Trying not to remember the heat in his voice when he'd told Dante to stay away from me. When the sunset bell finally rang, I joined the stream of household staff making their way toward the Great Hall. We filed in quietly, taking positions along the back and side walls while higher-ranking pack members claimed the center floor. The council sat in elevated seats near the front, their faces carefully neutral, and then Theron entered, and the room fell silent. He didn't look at me, didn't acknowledge anyone specifically. He simply took his position at the head of the hall and began to speak, his voice carrying to every corner of the crowded space. The council has reached its decision regarding the peripheral laws. My chest tightened. Around me, I felt other Omegas tense. Breath held. By a vote of 6-3, the motion to maintain the laws as written has failed. A ripple of shock moved through the crowd. 6-3. Someone had changed their vote. Someone had been convinced. Theron continued, his expression grave. The laws will return for comprehensive review. During this period, all current arrangements remain in effect. No reassignments, no enforcement of contested provisions. We will reconvene in 1 month with proposed revisions. Relief crashed through me so suddenly I had to lock my knees to stay upright. Beside me, a girl named Clara let out a shaky breath. We'd survive, at least for now. But as the crowd began to murmur and shift, I caught Theron's gaze across the packed hall. Just for a second. Just long enough to see something raw and unguarded flicker across his face before his usual control reasserted itself. And I understood, with sudden clarity, that whatever was happening between us, this strange, complicated thing I couldn't name, it was only beginning. The reprieve lasted exactly 4 days. 4 days of whispered conversations in the kitchens, of cautious hope spreading through the servant quarters like spring warmth after a brutal winter. 4 days of me trying to convince myself that Theron's glance across the great hall had meant nothing, that his intervention with the council vote was purely strategic, that the strange pull I felt whenever he was near was just my own foolish imagination. Then, the letter arrived. I found it slipped under my door on the 5th morning, a folded piece of heavy parchment sealed with wax I didn't recognize. My hands trembled as I broke it open, half expecting some official reprimand for a mistake I couldn't remember making. The handwriting was elegant, precise. The law you live under was written 83 years ago by Alpha Cornelius Ashford during the territorial consolidation. It has been amended 7 times, each amendment restricting rather than expanding freedoms. The original document contains a provision that was removed in the 4th revision, a provision that would change everything. If you want to understand what they're hiding, meet me in the archive room tonight after the 2nd bell. Come alone. D. Dante. I should have burned it immediately, should have reported it to someone. Instead, I folded it carefully and hid it beneath my mattress, my mind racing with possibilities I couldn't quite grasp. The day crawled past with agonizing slowness. I scrubbed floors, served lunch to the administrative wing, and tried to focus on mundane tasks while my thoughts spun in circles. What provision? What were they hiding? And why would Dante risk exposing it? By evening, I'd almost convinced myself not to go. The archive room was in the restricted section of the main building, accessible only to council members and scholars with explicit permission. Getting caught there would mean punishment far worse than kitchen duty. But curiosity won. Or maybe it was something deeper, a need to understand the invisible walls that shaped my existence. The 2nd bell rang at 10. I waited 15 minutes, then slipped out of the servant quarters wearing my darkest dress, a shawl pulled over my blonde hair. The corridors were mostly empty at this hour, just the occasional guard making rounds on a predictable schedule I'd memorized months ago out of pure self-preservation instinct. The archive room occupied the eastern corner of the 3rd floor. Its heavy oak door stood slightly ajar, lamplight spilling through the crack. I hesitated, every survival instinct screaming at me to turn back. Then I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room smelled like old paper and dust. Shelves lined every wall, packed with leather-bound volumes and rolled documents tied with faded ribbon. A single lamp burned on the central table, where Dante stood examining a large book, his expression unusually serious. "You came." He looked up, something like approval flickering across his face. "I wasn't sure you would." I shouldn't have. I kept my voice low, hyper-aware of how sound carried in these old stone buildings. "If anyone finds us here, they won't. The guards change shifts in 20 minutes, and this section isn't patrolled during the transition." He gestured to the book in front of him. "Come look at this." I moved closer, despite my better judgment. The book was enormous, its pages yellowed with age, covered in cramped handwriting and official stamps. Dante had it open to a section marked with a strip of cloth. "This is the original peripheral laws document," he said quietly. signed by my grandfather and witnessed by the full council of his era. Read this section here. He pointed to a paragraph near the bottom of the page. I leaned in, squinting at the archaic script. It took me a moment to parse the formal language, but when I did, my breath caught. In matters of territorial assignment and occupational designation, no wolf of Omega status shall be permanently bound to a single location or role without consent freely given and witnessed by neutral parties. Temporary assignments for training purposes not to exceed 6 lunar cycles. That's not... I looked up at Dante. That's not how it works now. No, it isn't. His expression was grim. Because in the 4th revision, 31 years ago, they changed consent freely given to assignment as deemed necessary by council authority. One phrase, one alteration, and suddenly Omegas went from having choice to having none. My mind reeled. Why would they do that? Control. Efficiency. Fear. Dante closed the book carefully. My grandfather's generation built these laws during wartime, when flexibility and individual agency were seen as assets. But as peace settled in, the power structure calcified. The council realized that giving Omegas autonomy meant they could leave bad situations, refuse dangerous work, organize among themselves, so they quietly amended the law and never spoke of the original version again. Does Theron know about this? Something complicated crossed Dante's face. My brother knows a lot of things. What he chooses to act on is another matter entirely. What's that supposed to mean? It means Theron is a good man trying to lead a system designed to resist change. He negotiates, compromises, plays the long game. Dante's voice carried frustration, but sometimes you don't need strategy. Sometimes you need truth thrown in people's faces until they can't ignore it anymore. I stepped back from the table, my head spinning. Why are you showing me this? What do you expect me to do with it? I expect you to decide whether you want to keep living in a cage built on lies, or whether you want to help tear the bars down. He held my gaze. The council reconvenes in 3 weeks to discuss revisions. If we can present evidence that the current laws violate the original framework, if we can force them to acknowledge what they've hidden, the word came out sharp. I'm nobody. I have no standing, no voice, no... You have everything they're afraid of. Dante moved around the table, his intensity almost overwhelming. You're intelligent, observant, and you understand both the formal hierarchy and the actual power dynamics that keep this place running. If you stood up in that council meeting and testified about how the amended laws have affected your life, how they've restricted and controlled you, they'd dismiss me in seconds, or worse. Not if you had documentation. Not if you had the original law in your hands, proving they've been operating under false authority for 3 decades. His eyes gleamed with something fierce. Not if you had an alpha willing to sponsor your testimony, you. Me. He smiled, but there was no humor in it. I know I'm not the brother you'd choose for this. I know Theron is the one you... He stopped himself, jaw tightening. But Theron won't do this. He'll negotiate and compromise and find some middle ground that changes nothing fundamental. I'm offering you a chance at real change. Before I could respond, footsteps echoed in the corridor outside. We both froze. The steps were too heavy, too purposeful to be a servant. Dante moved with sudden speed, extinguishing the lamp and pulling me behind one of the tall shelving units, just as the door swung fully open. Light from a hand lamp spilled into the room. I pressed myself against the shelves, barely breathing, acutely aware of Dante's proximity in the cramped space. Through the gap between volumes, I could see a figure entering, tall, broad-shouldered, moving with that distinctive, purposeful grace. Theron. My heart kicked against my ribs. He stood in the center of the archive room, lamp raised, scanning the space with systematic thoroughness. His expression was unreadable, but tension radiated from every line of his body. I know you're here. His voice was quiet, controlled. The guard at the east entrance mentioned seeing someone matching your description, Dante. And I'd wager you're not alone. Silence. I could feel Dante's breath against my hair. Could sense him calculating whether to reveal our position or wait it out. You're digging into the original peripheral laws. Theron continued, moving slowly through the room, which means you found the consent clause. Which means you're planning something inflammatory and counterproductive. He stopped near our hiding spot, close enough that I could see the muscle jumping in his jaw. "Come out, both of you." Dante sighed and stepped out from behind the shelves. I followed reluctantly, keeping my eyes down, face burning with shame and fear. Theron looked at me first, and the expression on his face made something in my chest twist painfully. Not anger. Worse, disappointment mixed with something raw I couldn't name. "You came here willingly?" he asked quietly. "Yes." My voice came out steady despite the trembling in my hands. He showed me the original law, the provision about consent that was removed. "I see." Theron turned to his brother, and now anger flickered across his features. "So you thought you'd recruit her for one of your dramatic reveals? Use her testimony to embarrass the council into action? I thought I'd give her truth and choice. 2 things she's been systematically denied." Dante's voice carried defiance. "Unlike you, I don't believe in protecting people from information they deserve to have. You don't believe in consequences either, or strategy, or understanding that exposing this particular truth at this particular moment could fracture the entire council structure." Theron's control was slipping, his voice rising slightly. "We're 3 weeks from a revision vote. 3 weeks from potential real change implemented through proper channels, and you want to throw a grenade into the process because it feels righteous." "Proper channels." Dante laughed bitterly. "How's that been working? How many decades of proper channels have maintained this lie? 31 years. I know exactly how long." Theron's voice dropped dangerously low. "Do you think I don't see the injustice? Do you think I don't understand what this law has done? But unlike you, I have to consider the aftermath. If we discredit the council's authority on this issue, we discredit their authority on everything. Border treaties, trade agreements, territorial disputes, all of it becomes questionable, and in that chaos, the people who suffer most are the ones you claim to be helping." The argument hung in the air between them, and I realized I was watching something deeper than a political disagreement. This was about philosophy, about identity, about 2 brothers who saw the world through fundamentally different lenses. "What do you want me to do?" I asked quietly. Both of them turned to look at me. "You're arguing about strategy and timing and consequences, but I'm the one who has to live under these laws every single day. So what do you want from me?" Theron's expression softened slightly. "I want you to wait. Trust that the revision process can work. Give me 3 weeks to navigate this properly. And if it doesn't work, if they revise the laws in name only and nothing actually changes, then we try something else." "You mean you try something else?" My voice was sharper than I'd intended. "I'll still be in the kitchens, still invisible, still trapped in whatever role the council decides I'm suited for. Your risk is political. Mine is existential." The silence that followed felt heavy. Theron stared at me like he was seeing something he hadn't expected, and I couldn't tell if that was good or terrifying. Finally, he spoke. "You're right. I apologize. I've been approaching this as an abstract problem when for you it's..." He stopped, jaw working. "Come to my study tomorrow morning, early before the household wakes. We'll talk about what real change looks like, and what you need it to include." "Why should she trust you more than me?" Dante demanded. Theron looked at his brother with something almost like pity. "Because I'm not using her to prove a point. I'm asking her to help shape the solution." He turned and left the archive room without waiting for a response, taking his lamp with him. The darkness that remained felt absolute. Dante exhaled slowly. "Well, that went differently than expected." "You knew he'd find us." "I suspected he might." He didn't sound particularly bothered. "My brother has always been somewhat obsessive about my activities. Recently, though..." He paused. "Recently, it's been more intense. I wonder why." I didn't answer, didn't acknowledge the implication in his tone. I just made my way to the door, navigating by memory and the faint moonlight filtering through high windows. "Celine." Dante's voice stopped me at the threshold. "Whatever you decide, make sure it's your decision, not his, not mine. Yours." I left without responding, hurrying through empty corridors back to the servant quarters. My hands were still shaking when I finally reached my room. I lay awake until dawn, staring at the ceiling, thinking about consent and choice, and the strange, impossible situation I'd found myself in. And I thought about Theron's face when he'd found me in that archive. The hurt and anger, and something else I didn't have a name for. Something that looked almost like jealousy. I arrived at Theron's study 20 minutes before dawn, when the sky was still that particular shade of gray that belongs to neither night nor morning. The administrative wing was silent except for my footsteps on the stone floor, each step sounding too loud in the emptiness. His door stood open. Lamplight spilled into the corridor, and I could see him inside, seated at his desk with papers spread before him. He looked up when I appeared in the doorway, and something in his expression made me hesitate. "Come in. Close the door." I did, my pulse quickening as the latch clicked into place. The study was smaller than I'd expected, lined with books and maps, dominated by a massive desk covered in documents. A fire burned low in the grate, making the room warm despite the early hour. Theron stood, and I noticed the shadows under his eyes, the way his shirt was slightly rumpled, as if he'd been working through the night. He gestured to a chair across from his desk. "Sit, please." The courtesy felt strange. I lowered myself into the chair, acutely aware of the impropriety of being alone with the Alpha King in his private study before sunrise. "If anyone found out, no one will disturb us," he said, as if reading my thoughts. "I've made sure of that." He remained standing, one hand resting on the back of his own chair. "I owe you an apology for last night. Several apologies, actually." "You don't need to." "Yes, I do." His voice was firm. "First, for the way I reacted to finding you with Dante. I had no right to speak to you that way, or to make assumptions about your choices. Second, for treating you like a political problem rather than a person whose life is directly affected by decisions I make or fail to make." He paused, jaw tightening. "And third, for not showing you that document myself. You deserve to know the truth about the original law. I should have been the one to tell you." I sat there, stunned by the directness of it. Alphas didn't apologize to Omegas. Certainly not Alpha Kings. "Why didn't you?" I asked quietly. "Tell me, I mean, if you knew about the consent clause, why keep it secret?" "Because I'm a coward." The words came out flat, emotionless. Then he moved around the desk and sank into his chair with a heaviness that suggested exhaustion, beyond the physical. "No, that's not quite right. I'm a strategist who's forgotten the difference between patience and cowardice." He pulled one of the documents toward him. Even upside down, I could see it was old, the parchment discolored with age. "My father made a lot of decisions I disagreed with," Theron said. "Some of them I've been trying to unravel for the past 3 years since he died. But changing laws in a pack this size, with a council this entrenched..." He shook his head. "Every alteration creates ripples. Every reform threatens someone's power base. So I've been moving slowly, carefully, building coalitions and making compromises, while people suffer under unjust laws." His eyes met mine, and I saw pain there, yes, while people suffer. I tell myself it's temporary, that lasting change requires patience, but the truth is more complicated. He leaned back in his chair. "I'm afraid of making things worse, of acting rashly and creating chaos that hurts the people I'm trying to protect. My father ruled through force and certainty. I've tried to rule through negotiation and consensus, but lately I wonder if that just makes me weak." The vulnerability in his voice surprised me. This wasn't the controlled, authoritative Alpha King everyone else saw. This was someone carrying impossible weight and questioning every choice. "Dante thinks you care more about stability than justice," I said carefully. "Dante thinks a lot of things." Theron's mouth tightened. "My brother sees the world in absolutes. Wrong and right, oppression and freedom, stagnation and revolution. He's never had to make decisions that affect thousands of lives, never had to balance competing needs and navigate consequences that ripple out for years." He paused. "But that doesn't mean he's always wrong. So what do we do?" I leaned forward. "The council meets in 3 weeks. What happens then?" "That depends partly on you." Theron pulled out another document, this one newer. "I've been drafting a revised version of the peripheral laws. It restores the consent clause, adds protections against arbitrary reassignment, creates an appeals process. But it's incomplete because I don't actually know what would make the biggest difference to the people living under these restrictions. I need your input." He slid the document across the desk. I picked it up, hands trembling slightly, and began to read. The language was formal, dense with legal terminology, but the substance was clear. Everything Theron had described, laid out in careful detail. "This is good," I said after a moment, "but there's something missing." "What?" "Education access. Under current laws, Omegas can only attend training programs approved by the Council, and those programs are limited to domestic skills. But if someone wanted to learn record keeping, or healing, or any of the administrative roles, there's no pathway." I looked up at him. "You can give us freedom to choose, but if we don't have the knowledge or skills for anything except what we're already doing, the choice becomes meaningless." Theron's expression shifted, something like respect flickering across his features. "You're right. I should have seen that." He reached for a pen, making a note on the document. "What else?" We spent the next hour going through the revision line by line. I pointed out gaps, suggested clarifications, explained how certain provisions would be interpreted by people looking for loopholes. Theron listened intently, asked questions, adjusted language. At some point, the awkwardness faded, and it became simply two people working toward a shared goal. The sky outside the window had shifted from gray to pale gold when he finally set down his pen and rubbed his eyes. "This is better," he said quietly. "Significantly better. Thank you." "Will the Council approve it? Some of them will hate it. Others will see it as overdue reform. The vote will be close." He looked at me directly. "If Dante goes forward with his plan to expose the historical deception, if he brings the original document to the Council meeting and makes a public accusation, it will fracture everything. Some members will vote for revision out of shame or fear of exposure. Others will dig in harder, seeing it as an attack on their authority. The law might pass, but the divisions it creates could destabilize the pack for years. But if you present the revision without addressing the historical lie, they'll think they can just make cosmetic changes and return to business as usual." "Yes." He exhaled slowly, "which is why I need to make a choice I've been avoiding. I need to decide whether I'm willing to risk destabilization for the sake of truth." The weight of that decision hung between us. I thought about Dante's fierce certainty, his belief that truth mattered more than strategy. And I thought about Theron's careful approach, his fear of unintended consequences. "What if there's a middle way?" I said slowly. "What if you present the revision, but also acknowledge the historical context? Not as an accusation, but as a recognition that the laws have evolved away from their original intent. You could frame it as returning to foundational principles, rather than implementing radical change." Theron stared at me for a long moment. Then something shifted in his expression. Surprise giving way to something warmer. "That could work. It gives the Council an honorable path forward, instead of forcing them into a defensive position." He leaned forward. "Where did you learn to think politically?" "Kitchens." I smiled slightly. "You'd be surprised how much negotiation happens over who gets which tasks and which shifts, and how much information flows through spaces that powerful people ignore. I'm beginning to understand that I've been ignoring the wrong things." His voice was quiet, almost intimate. "You're remarkable, Celine. I hope you know that." The compliment caught me off guard. Heat rose in my face, and I looked down at my hands. "I'm just trying to survive." "No. You're trying to change the system that's been controlling you. That's different. That takes courage." He paused. "I should have seen you sooner, should have recognized." He stopped himself, jaw tightening. The silence stretched. I could hear my own heartbeat, feel the strange electricity in the air between us. When I finally looked up, Theron was watching me with an intensity that made my breath catch. "Why does it bother you so much?" I asked quietly. "When Dante talks to me," his expression went carefully neutral. "My brother has a history of using people for his causes without considering their well-being. That's not the whole reason." "No." The word came out rough. "It's not." He stood abruptly and moved to the window, putting distance between us. His shoulders were tense, silhouetted against the morning light. "I don't have the right to feel the way I do," he said, not looking at me. We're in completely different positions. The power imbalance alone makes any personal interest inappropriate. But watching him stand close to you, seeing him make you smile." He stopped, hands curling into fists at his sides. "It makes me want to do things that have nothing to do with rational leadership." My heart was pounding now. "What kind of things?" "Celine." My name sounded like a warning. "Don't ask questions you don't want answered." "Maybe I do want them answered." He turned then, and the look on his face stole my breath. There was heat there, barely controlled, mixed with frustration and longing, and something almost like desperation. "You should leave," he said quietly. "Before I do something we'll both regret." I should have listened, should have stood and walked out and pretended this conversation had never happened. Instead, I stayed in my chair, holding his gaze. "What if I don't want to leave?" The words hung in the air between us. Theron went very still, and I watched something shift in his expression. Control wavering, giving way to raw want. He crossed the room in 3 strides. For a moment, I thought he might pull me out of the chair, might close the distance completely. Instead, he stopped just short of touching me, his hands clenching and releasing at his sides. "Tell me to stop," he said, voice rough. "Tell me this is a terrible idea, and that I'm abusing my position, and that you want nothing to do with me beyond the professional." "I can't." "Why not?" "Because it would be a lie." The admission felt like stepping off a cliff. "Because I think about you constantly. Because when you looked at Dante yesterday, when your hands curled into fists, I felt it here." I pressed my palm to my chest, because inappropriate or not, power imbalance or not, something is happening between us, and pretending otherwise feels more dishonest than acknowledging it. His control shattered. He reached down and pulled me out of the chair, his hands spanning my waist, drawing me against him. We stood there, inches apart, both breathing hard. "I can't offer you what you deserve," he said quietly. "I can't court you properly, or make promises I might not be able to keep. The pack would see it as favoritism. The council would use it against both of us. We'd have to be careful to the point of secrecy, and even then, I reached up and pressed my fingers to his mouth, silencing him. "I know all that. I'm not asking for grand gestures or public declarations. I'm just asking for honesty about what this is." He caught my hand, pressing it against his chest where I could feel his heart racing. "What this is," he said slowly, "is me being half obsessed with a woman I have no business wanting. What this is me lying awake at night thinking about your voice, and the way you stood up to me and the intelligence in your eyes when you talk about things that matter. What this is jealousy so intense it's become a physical thing whenever my brother looks at you." "Good," I whispered, "because I need to know I'm not alone in this madness." He made a sound low in his throat, something between a laugh and a groan. Then his hand came up to cup my face, thumb brushing across my cheekbone with devastating gentleness. "You're not alone." His voice was barely audible, not even close. The kiss, when it came, felt inevitable. His mouth found mine with a hunger that matched the tension that had been building between us for days. I made a sound against his lips, my hands fisting in his shirt, pulling him closer. He responded by deepening the kiss, one hand tangling in my blonde hair, while the other pressed against the small of my back. It lasted maybe 30 seconds, maybe a lifetime. When we finally broke apart, both breathing hard, the world felt fundamentally altered. "This is complicated," Theron said, his forehead resting against mine. "Everything is complicated. The council meeting is 3 weeks away. Let's deal with one impossible thing at a time." He laughed quietly, and the sound transformed his face into something younger, lighter. "When did you become the pragmatic one?" "Right around the time you kissed me in your study before sunrise." His expression sobered. "We have to be careful. If anyone finds out before the vote..." "I know." I stepped back reluctantly, immediately missing his warmth. "I should go. The kitchen staff will be waking soon." He nodded but caught my hand before I could move away. "Tonight, after dinner service. There's a path through the gardens that leads to the old training grounds. No one uses it anymore. Meet me there." "Why?" "Because 3 weeks is a long time, and I don't think I can go that long without seeing you again." He squeezed my hand gently. "Because whatever happens with the council vote, whatever challenges we face, I need you to know this is real." I nodded, not trusting my voice. Then I slipped out of his study and made my way back through the waking corridors, my lips still burning from his kiss. My mind racing with everything that had just changed. The 3 weeks that followed were a study in controlled chaos and secret moments stolen from the edges of routine. By day, I worked in the kitchens and attended to my assigned tasks while whispers circulated about the upcoming council vote. By night, I met Theron in the abandoned training grounds, where we talked about law revisions and pack politics, and gradually, carefully, about ourselves. He told me about growing up in his father's shadow, about the weight of expectations that had shaped him since childhood. I told him about losing my parents to border raids when I was 14, about the years spent learning to be invisible as a survival strategy. We didn't always touch. Sometimes we just sat on the old stone benches and talked until the moon crossed the sky, and those conversations felt more intimate than any physical contact. But sometimes we did touch, his hand finding mine in the darkness, his lips against my temple when I told him something difficult, the way he'd pull me close when the night air turned cold, his arms wrapped around me like he could protect me from everything that threatened us both. Dante noticed, of course. I caught him watching us during a council preparation meeting, his expression unreadable. He didn't confront me directly, but there was something knowing in the way he smiled when our paths crossed. It made me nervous. The revised peripheral laws document went through 6 drafts. Theron presented sections to individual council members, gauging reactions and adjusting language based on their concerns. The education access provision I'd suggested became a central pillar, expanded to include apprenticeships and skill-sharing programs. Slowly, painfully, support began to build. 2 days before the vote, I received another letter slipped under my door. Dante's handwriting again, but the tone was different this time. I know what's happening between you and my brother. I'm not going to interfere. Your choices are your own. But you should know that council member Helena has been asking questions about Theron's unusual interest in household staff. She's preparing to raise concerns about favoritism and inappropriate relationships during the vote. If you care about him, and I think you do, you need to make a choice. Step back and let him navigate this alone, or stand with him publicly and accept the consequences. There's no middle ground anymore. The vote is in 2 days. Choose wisely. Then my hands shook as I read it. Helena was one of the most conservative council members, vocal in her support of traditional hierarchy. If she raised concerns about Theron's judgment, if she framed the law revision as the result of personal bias rather than genuine reform. I found Theron in his study that evening. He took one look at my face and dismissed the advisors he'd been meeting with, closing the door behind them. What happened? I handed him the letter wordlessly, watched his expression darken as he read it. Helena, he said flatly. Of course. She's been resistant from the beginning, but I thought... He stopped, jaw working. I should have been more careful. Should have anticipated this. It's not your fault. Isn't it? He crumpled the letter in his fist. I knew getting close to you was risky. I knew there would be political consequences. But I was selfish enough to do it anyway. The self-recrimination in his voice made something in my chest ache. I crossed to where he stood and took his hands, forcing him to look at me. Listen to me. Whatever happens at that council meeting, whatever Helena says or implies, the law revision is good on its own merits. You've built genuine support for it. Yes, some people will question your motivations. Let them. The work speaks for itself. And what about us? His voice was quiet, almost lost. If they force me to choose between pushing for reform and protecting you from scrutiny, then you choose the reform. The words came out steadier than I felt. The peripheral laws affect hundreds of people. Whatever is between us, however real it feels, can't be more important than that. He pulled me against him, burying his face in my hair. I hate this. I hate that caring about you has become a liability. I hate that they can use it as a weapon. So do I. I held him tightly. But Dante was right. There's no middle ground. We either step back and I stay invisible while you navigate this alone, or I stand with you publicly and we face whatever comes together. You shouldn't have to make that choice. Neither should you. But here we are. We stood there in silence for a long moment. Then Theron pulled back, his gray eyes intense. If you stand with me publicly, if you testify at the council meeting about how the current laws have affected you, it will make you visible in ways you've never been before. Helena will attack your credibility. Others will question your motives. And even if the revision passes, there will be people in this pack who see you as the Omega who manipulated their Alpha King. I know. You could be safer just staying out of it. Let me handle the political fallout, present the revision as I planned without involving you directly, and spend the rest of my life wondering if I was brave enough when it mattered. I shook my head. No, I've been invisible for too long. If there's a chance, even a small one, that speaking up could help change things for others like me, then I have to take it. Pride and pain warred across his features. You're terrifying, you know that? Good. You could use someone who scares you occasionally. He almost smiled. Then his expression turned serious. The council meets at sunset tomorrow. If you're going to testify, we need to prepare. Helena will try to discredit you, and she's skilled at finding weaknesses. We spent that night going over potential questions and challenges. Theron coached me on how to frame my experiences factually, how to deflect personal attacks, how to keep focus on the law itself, rather than getting drawn into debates about propriety or my relationship with him. By the time dawn broke, I was exhausted but ready. The next day passed in a blur of nervous energy. I worked my morning shift mechanically, my mind elsewhere. Clara noticed and asked if I was ill. I lied and said I'd slept poorly. Miriam gave me concerned looks, but didn't press. At sunset, I changed into the cleanest dress I owned and made my way to the assembly hall. The corridors were packed with wolves. Council members, advisors, household staff, border patrol leaders. Everyone seemed to sense this vote would matter. I slipped into the hall and found a position along the side wall, trying to be inconspicuous despite my racing heart. The council members filed in and took their elevated seats. Theron entered last, his expression controlled and unreadable. He didn't look at me. The session began with formal procedures, reading of previous meeting minutes, acknowledgement of attendees. Then Council Head Marcus cleared his throat. We gathered to vote on the proposed revision to the peripheral laws. Alpha Theron Ashford has submitted a comprehensive document outlining changes to assignment protocols, consent requirements, and educational access. Before we proceed to discussion and vote, I understand there are preliminary concerns to be addressed. He looked at Helena. Councilmember Helena has requested time to speak. My stomach dropped. Theron's expression didn't change, but I saw his hands tighten on the arms of his chair. Helena stood, her silver hair pulled back severely, her face set in disapproving lines. Thank you, Council Head. I wish to raise a question of impartiality before we proceed. It has come to my attention that Alpha Theron has been conducting private consultations with an Omega from the household staff, consultations that extended well beyond professional boundaries. This raises serious concerns about whether the proposed revision stems from genuine policy analysis or personal bias. A ripple of reaction moved through the hall. I felt dozens of eyes turning toward me, searching. My face burned, but I kept my expression neutral. Theron stood slowly. When he spoke, his voice was calm, but carried an edge of steel. Councilmember Helena's concern is noted. I will address it directly. Yes, I consulted with Omega Celine during the revision process. Her insights into how the current laws function at ground level proved invaluable. Her input improved the document significantly. If that constitutes bias, then I'm guilty. But I would argue that failing to consult the people most affected by these laws would be a far greater failure of judgment. Consultation is one thing, Helena pressed. Personal involvement is another. Are you denying that your interest in this particular Omega extends beyond the professional? The hall went silent. I could see Dante leaning forward in his seat, watching his brother with intense focus. Marcus looked uncomfortable. Several other council members exchanged glances. Theron held Helena's gaze for a long moment. Then he said quietly, "No, I'm not denying it." The admission sent shock rippling through the crowd. Helena's expression turned triumphant. But before she could speak, Theron continued, "However, my personal feelings don't change the facts. The current peripheral laws, as written, deviate significantly from their original framework. The consent clause that existed in the first version was removed 31 years ago, without public debate or transparent justification. That historical reality exists independently of any personal relationship I might have. The proposed revision attempts to restore principles that were lost, not create new ones." He pulled out a document, old, carefully preserved. My breath caught. The original law. He was using Dante's strategy after all, but on his own terms. "This is the founding document," Theron said, holding it up for the council to see. "Signed by my grandfather, witnessed by the full council of that era. It contains explicit language about consent and choice that has been gradually eroded through subsequent amendments. I'm not asking this council to implement radical change. I'm asking us to return to our own foundational principles." The hall erupted in murmurs. Helena's expression shifted from triumph to uncertainty. Marcus called for order, his voice sharp. "This is highly irregular," Helena protested. "Introducing historical documents without proper advance notice." "The document has been in our archives for 83 years, Theron interrupted, available to any council member who cared to examine our legal history. The fact that it's surprising speaks to how far we've drifted from our origins." "Nevertheless," Helena persisted, "the question of your judgment remains. How can we trust that these revisions serve the Pack's interests rather than your personal desires?" Before Theron could respond, I found myself stepping forward. My legs felt unsteady, but my voice came out clear. "May I speak?" Every head in the hall turned toward me. The weight of all those stares felt crushing, but I forced myself to meet Marcus's eyes. The council head looked surprised, then thoughtful. "This is irregular, but given that you've been named in this discussion, I'll allow it." "Step forward." I moved to the center of the hall, acutely aware of how small I must look surrounded by so many powerful wolves. Theron's expression was unreadable, but I thought I saw fear flickering in his eyes. "My name is Selene," I began, pleased that my voice didn't shake. "I've worked in the household staff for 4 years. Under the current peripheral laws, I have no choice about my housing, my work assignment, or my schedule. When I was reassigned 3 times in my first year, moved between dormitories without notice or explanation, I had no recourse and no voice. That's not governance. That's control without accountability." I took a breath, gathering courage. Alpha Theron asked for my input on the revision because I live the reality these laws create, not because of any personal relationship, but because good policy requires understanding the people it affects. Yes, we've become close during this process. Yes, there are personal feelings involved, but those feelings don't invalidate the work. If anything, they've helped him understand what he couldn't see from a position of power. Helena started to interrupt, but I pressed on. "You can question his judgment, you can question my motives, but you can't question the facts. The original law protected consent and choice. Those protections were removed. The proposed revision restores them. Vote based on that reality, not on your discomfort with an alpha king who chose to listen to people you consider beneath notice." The silence that followed felt enormous. I stood there, trembling now, waiting for the condemnation. Instead, Marcus spoke thoughtfully. "Thank you, Omega Selene. Your testimony is noted." He turned to the council. "I move that we proceed to discussion of the revision's actual content, rather than continuing to debate the Alpha King's personal life." "Those in favor?" 6 hands rose immediately. After a moment, 2 more joined them. Only Helena abstained. What followed was 2 hours of intense debate. Council members questioned specific provisions, suggested amendments, argued about implementation timelines. Theron fielded every concern with patient precision, referring back to the original document when necessary. I stayed in the hall, watching it unfold, hardly daring to breathe. Finally, Marcus called for the vote. "All those in favor of adopting the revised peripheral laws as presented, with the noted amendments regarding transition period and appeals process," one by one, hands rose. 6, 7, 8. 8 votes. It needed 6 for a 2/3 majority. "Motion passes," Marcus announced. "The revised peripheral laws will be implemented beginning next month, with full transition completed within 3 months. This session is adjourned." The hall erupted in reaction. Some cheering, some arguing, everyone talking at once. I stood frozen, unable to process that it had actually worked. That we'd won. Theron found me in the chaos. He didn't touch me, not with so many eyes watching, but the look on his face said everything. Relief and pride and something deeper. "You were magnificent," he said quietly. "We were." I corrected, and he smiled. Dante appeared at his brother's elbow, his expression complicated. "Well played," he said to Theron. "Using the historical angle without making it an accusation. I wouldn't have thought of that approach. I had good counsel." Theron's eyes met mine briefly. "I can see that." Dante turned to me. "For what it's worth, I'm glad you found your voice. The Pack needs more people willing to speak uncomfortable truths." He paused. "Even if it means I lost my chance with you." "Dante?" I started, but he waved me off. "No, it's fine. I always knew where your attention really lay. I just enjoyed watching my brother squirm. He grinned. But I'm genuinely happy for you both. Try not to break each other's hearts. He disappeared into the crowd before either of us could respond. Theron shook his head slowly. My brother is exhausting, but he cares. In his own chaotic way, yes. The next few hours were a blur of conversations and questions, and gradually dispersing crowds. By the time the assembly hall finally emptied, full night had fallen outside. Theron found me sitting on one of the stone benches in the courtyard, staring up at the stars. You should be resting, he said, settling beside me. Too wound up to rest. I leaned against his shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him. It's real, isn't it? The laws actually changed. They did. Thanks largely to you. His arm came around me. Though Helena will make your life difficult for a while. She doesn't forgive challenges to her authority easily. Let her try. I'm not invisible anymore. He laughed quietly. No, you're definitely not. He pressed a kiss to the top of my head. What happens now? Now? I considered. Now I apply for one of those education programs. Maybe record keeping. I'm good with details. You're good with everything. His voice was warm. And us? Where do we go from here? Forward. I tilted my face up to look at him, carefully probably. With complications. But forward. I can work with that. He kissed me properly then, slow and thorough, while the stars wheeled overhead. The months that followed brought changes both subtle and profound. The revised peripheral laws took effect, and suddenly Omegas across the pack had choices they'd never experienced. Some chose to stay in their current roles. Others moved into new positions, pursued training, relocated to different territories. Not everyone was happy about it. Helena and her allies grumbled about chaos and disrupted efficiency. But the world didn't end. The pack adapted. I enrolled in Marcus's record-keeping apprenticeship, spending my mornings in the archives learning documentation systems and legal protocols. The afternoons I still worked in the kitchens, but now by choice rather than assignment. Miriam promoted me to assistant head cook, acknowledging skills she'd apparently noticed but never commented on before. My relationship with Theron remained complicated. We were careful about public displays, aware that some pack members still viewed our connection with skepticism, but we stopped hiding entirely. We attended council sessions together, worked on policy documents side by side, walked through the gardens in daylight, rather than only meeting in secret. Dante left for the Eastern Territories to help negotiate a trade dispute, but not before pulling me aside to say he was proud of how things had turned out. You made my brother better, he said. Don't let him forget that. 6 months after the vote, I stood in the assembly hall again, this time as an official record keeper, documenting a session about border treaty renewals. Theron sat in his usual position, managing the discussion with that careful authority I'd come to know so well. At one point, our eyes met across the hall, and he smiled. Just a small private expression, but it felt like a promise. After the session ended, we walked back to his study together. No longer servants and Alpha King, just two people who'd fought for something important, and one who'd found each other in the process and chosen to stay. I've been thinking, Theron said as we entered his office, about making some changes to the council structure. Adding representatives from different pack levels, including household staff, creating actual channels for voices that have been excluded. That's ambitious. I settled into the chair across from his desk, the same chair I'd sat in that first dawn meeting. Also necessary. Would you consider being one of those representatives? He leaned back, watching me. You understand both the formal hierarchy and the actual power dynamics. You're not afraid to speak uncomfortable truths. The pack needs that. I thought about the frightened Omega who'd hidden against the courtyard wall months ago, who'd believed invisibility was safety. She felt like a different person now. Yes, I said, I'll do it. His smile was brilliant. Good. Because leading this pack is significantly easier when I have someone beside me who tells me when I'm being an idiot. Happy to serve, I said dryly. He came around the desk and pulled me up into his arms. I love you, he said quietly.